Introductory Lecture 2, Laying the Cards on the Table. Before we delve into the 5 units that make up Is Capitalism Good for the Poor, I want to state up front the conclusions we reached in researching the evidence and writing lessons for students on this topic. Professor Walton's essay, which we considered in the course introduction, makes the historical case for economic growth rather than redistribution as the path out of poverty. So the question, is capitalism good for the poor, really translates into, does capitalism foster economic growth? We believe that both historical and contemporary evidence say yes. The combination of institutions known as capitalism, open competitive markets, defined and secure property rights, the rule of law, and entrepreneurial incentives to foster invention, innovation, and production, increases wealth and raises standards of living. How did we reach that conclusion, and what kind of evidence supports it? We've already seen the historical evidence. It establishes that until the middle of the 18th century, abject, energy-sapping poverty was the norm worldwide. And then institutions changed. Starting in approximately 1500, the roots of capitalist institutions are seen in Europe. Appearing as feudalism ended, nation-states grew stronger and became more competitive, and governments secured a monopoly on coercion and competitive violence by reducing piracy and brigandage. By 1750, these institutional changes fostered and sustained the Second Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which leads to economic growth and to significant increases in per capita incomes and standards of living. Beginning around 1750, the institutions that sustained economic growth and improved material well-being are those institutions we will identify as fundamental to capitalism. Units 2 through 5 in Is Capitalism Good for the Poor analyze the operation of these capitalist institutions, explaining how and why they create economic growth. Now, you're probably not surprised that we've answered the title question, Is Capitalism Good for the Poor, with a confident yes, and that the lessons in the unit build a case for that answer. However, we hope that acknowledging our conclusions up front gives us the opportunity to assure you that those conclusions were not foregone, and that we took great pains to ensure that this set of lessons is not just a strident ideological rant. Instead, we hope we've offered a request for your considered attention to the evidence. The data presented herein comes from respected mainstream sources, and it's readily available to anyone with an internet connection. In addition, we've acknowledged, and in fact included, challenges, caveats, and dissent in an effort to present a reasoned analysis. We believe that the evidence will speak loudly, both to you and to your students. In the interest of laying the cards on the table, before we delve into the unit, we want to use this lecture as a summary of that evidence and the conclusions that it supports. Join me in a mental exercise. Picture a map of the world and mentally color in the countries that aren't poor, or at least that you don't consider to be rich. Most of Africa, without a doubt. South and Central America, certainly. Most of Asia. Most of the Middle East. Maybe not Saudi Arabia unless you factor in income distribution. Does your map look somewhat like this? Per capita income data generally supports this picture. Okay, start over. Blank map. In your head, mentally color in the countries of the world that are usually labeled capitalist. Here it is, Canada, the United States, and Western Europe, of course. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. Not much else, right? Now, suppose we superimposed one map on the other. Interesting, isn't it? There's really no overlap. Places that are poor aren't capitalist, and places that are capitalist aren't poor. This should at least pique our interest enough to investigate further. Here's another look at the interface between capitalism and standard of living. Using published data from a variety of sources including the World Bank and the United Nations, the Fraser Institute in British Columbia annually creates an Index of Economic Freedom. The index is based on such factors as how much the economy relies on voluntary exchange, the extent and security of personal property rights, the amount of restriction on foreign trade, and the stability of the monetary system. You can check out all the factors used in compiling the index by going to the Fraser website at freetheworld.com, and the exact URL is included in the lesson outline. Because the components of the index reflect the operation of the institutions we will identify as fundamental to capitalism, we can use Fraser's index number for each nation as a measure of how capitalist it is. The next few slides were taken from the Fraser website, and they give you an overview of Fraser's work. Using Fraser data, then, we can explore questions relevant to our inquiry about capitalism and wealth. This graph looks at the interface between countries' index numbers, which we've called a measure of capitalism, and their level of economic growth, which we've established as the key to raising a nation out of poverty. The colored vertical bars are derived by using the Fraser index numbers to divide the nations of the world into quintiles, or fifths. The red bar represents the 20% of nations with the lowest economic freedom index numbers. In other words, these are arguably the least capitalist nations in the world. The darker green bar on the right represents the quintile or fifth of nations with the highest economic freedom index numbers. Again, we're using the index numbers as an indicator of the extent of capitalism. So the green bars would represent the most capitalist countries. This graph tells us that economies that depend on capitalist institutions experience greater rates of economic growth than economies that do not. In fact, those nations that are least capitalist, the red bar, are actually getting poorer. Guess which countries they are? Right, most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. Anyone who pays even cursory attention to world news, AIDS, famine, civil war, probably isn't surprised that growth rates in much of Africa are negative. A doubter could react to the previous Fraser graph by noting that just because a country's economy is growing rapidly doesn't mean that it's rich. And that's a good point. So let's look at some more data. This graph directly addresses the issue of capitalism and economic well-being, because the vertical axis, which determines the size of each bar, is per capita income. Basically, the graph confirms the results of our overlapping mental maps exercise. Capitalist countries have higher per capita incomes than countries with little economic freedom. While it certainly isn't enough to establish a causal relationship between capitalism and wealth, it at least confirms the association. Most of us don't find it surprising, but the next graph, dealing with income distribution, is surprising to many people, and it definitely gives us food for thought. Here, the vertical axis measures the percentage of a nation's total income that goes to the poorest 10% of the population. Now, if you think about it mathematically, if income were equally distributed, 10% of the population would get 10% of the income. And obviously, that isn't the case anywhere. Instead, the richest 10% receives more than 10% of a nation's income, and the poorest 10% of the population receives much less than 10% of total income. How much less? Well, this graph tells us that the poorest 10% of the population receives somewhere between 2.25 and 2.83% of national income. And this is the surprising part. The degree of economic freedom makes almost no difference in that distribution. What the graph tells us is that the poor throughout the world get about 2.5% of a nation's income, regardless of the degree of economic freedom. Contrary to conventional wisdom, Poor people in non-capitalist countries don't get an appreciably bigger slice of the pie than people in capitalist countries. So logically, what does that mean? To oversimplify the case, it means that if you're going to be poor, it's better to be poor in a capitalist country than in one without capitalist institutions. Because 2.5% of a big pie is lots better than 2.5% of a small pie. Per capita income of the poorest segment of the population in those countries with capitalist institutions, remember those are the green bars, is double or triple the income of the poor in countries with less economic freedom. Social indicator data supports the conclusions we reached by looking at per capita income. Capitalist nations have, for example, lower rates of infant mortality, lower rates of child labor, and higher life expectancies. The evidence is compelling. Capitalism raises total wealth without reducing the share received by those at the bottom of the income distribution, which means that people everywhere on a nation's income scale benefit from economic growth. In simplest terms, when a country gets richer, the poor get richer too. It's this data that supports the conclusions of Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? And underpins our goal to explain how and why capitalist institutions can raise standards of living, especially for those at the bottom. A few words are in order here about what this unit is not. While each of these is an important topic in and of itself, none is a focus of this particular set of lessons. Is Capitalism Good for the Poor is not about poverty in America or U.S. poverty policy and programs. It's not about distribution of income or the determinants of distribution of income. It does not address the relative value of alternative political systems, nor does it deal with development economies. It's probably also important to state clearly that the unit is not intended as an attack on government or a plea for any particular type of government. Indeed, one of the institutions we've identified as fundamental to capitalism is the rule of law, and it's hard to imagine an effective rule of law without a solid foundation in government. Lastly, Is Capitalism Good for the Poor is intended neither as an attack on or an apology for corporations. Incorporation is nothing more than a tool for amassing the capital necessary for large-scale production efforts. There are, quote, good corporations that promote production and help raise standards of living, and there are, quote, bad corporations that do not. Unlike the rule of law, corporations aren't necessary to capitalism. It would be possible to have capitalism without corporations if we're willing to accept the trade-offs. For example, without corporations, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett would be the only people rich enough to start airlines. And what if they didn't want to? To recap then, this lecture was intended to lay the cards on the table in terms of the conclusions that form the foundation for the curriculum unit Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? We believe the answer to that question is yes, and the 5 lesson outlines and student activities offer reasons, evidence, and explanations. We hope that you and your students will be able to see how and why we reached our conclusions, and decide for yourselves whether they make sense to you. So, let's get into the lessons.